Hello everyone, welcome to this Elevate Parent webinar. We're going to be starting in just a couple of minutes at 6 o'clock, so please grab whatever you need. I've got a lemon and ginger tea. You might want tea, glass of water, glass of wine, however the evening is making you feel. And if you want to grab a pen and paper as well, that would be great, and I'll see you back at 6. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Elevate Parent webinar about memory and memorization. For those of you who are maybe joining the webinars for the first time, who haven't met me before, my name is Molly, and I'm a head coach and presenter here at Elevate. My sort of two roles that I've got there. My role as a head coach involves me meeting with families and students to match them with an Elevate coach and determine what sort of approach we should take to make that student's life easier in the classroom, help them realise their true potential and boost those study skills. And in my role as a presenter, that involves me going into schools and sixth forms across the UK and delivering seminars to parents, to teachers and families like yourselves, and of course, most importantly, directly to students as well. So tonight I'm going to be sort of bringing my experience in those two different roles in coaching and presenting to talk about memory. So show you guys as parents and families sort of how you can improve your child's memorization process. That's the sort of key aim for tonight. So in terms of the structure, if you are a webinar regular, you will know the structure very well. I'll start with a little bit of sort of housekeeping, then I'll move on to a bit of an introduction to who we are at Elevate, what we do, and then I'll move into the main content for this evening, so practical tips and some theory and neuroscience behind memory, and then I'll leave a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A. That Q&A, you can actually submit questions directly to me. So how you would do that is there is a chat bubble. If you're viewing the website on the link that Jess would have sent you, so on our website, if you scroll down to the bottom right, there's a little chat bubble and you can pop a question to Jess at any point throughout the webinar. And if you want it for the Q&A, just say Q&A and leave your question there. If you're actually viewing us on YouTube at the moment, it's a slightly different process. There is a chat, but that isn't being monitored by Jess. So if you do want to to submit a question. How you do that is you just scroll down into the description on the YouTube video, you click on our website link, and then you can watch the webinar there and use the chat too, but it's completely optional. But yeah, I will answer some questions directly at the end. So final little bit of housekeeping before we move on. I always like to say it, I know it is probably quite obvious, but I know this is called a parent webinar, but I myself am not a parent, and this is absolutely not sort of parenting advice. That would be totally outside of my remit. I wouldn't dream of telling you guys how to do your job. That's what you guys are the experts in. Instead, I'm really just here as a representative to sort of talk to you a little bit about Elevate, the sort of techniques and study skill habits that we introduce students to, and a little bit about the sort of neuroscience and psychology behind the skills that we show students as well. And across the 22 years of research that we've been doing, I'll sort of touch on that too. So, housekeeping over, let's move on. So a little bit of an intro. Again, I do apologise if you are a webinar regular and you've seen this before. Please do just sit back, relax, and chill for a moment. But I do know that we've got lots and lots of parents who are joining us for the first time, so thank you so much. Let me give you a bit of an intro to who we are and what we do. So Elevate, we are the global leader in delivering study skills advice. We've been around for 22 years now. We started in Australia, and throughout that 22-year journey, we've really been trying to better understand this question that you can see here as the first bullet point. What do, quote unquote, top students do in order to get top results? So I'm putting quotation marks because of course there isn't a strata of top students, that doesn't exist. Instead, it's just about process. It's just about what are students doing to get those top results. So we've conducted ourselves a wealth of quantitative and qualitative research, and throughout that research journey, it's become abundantly clear that, as I said, students who get these top results, they do not achieve that because they are intellectually smarter than anyone else, because they have a higher IQ or any other metrics that we might use. Instead, to put it simply, it's that they're working smarter. They're working in a more efficient and effective way. So our research has shown that there are 13 key skill areas across which the habits of these higher performing students really do differ quite drastically from lower and middle performing students. So it's these techniques, these instincts of these high achieving students that form the basis of the programs that we run, so that we can introduce these skills and techniques to all. And we deliver these programs, as I said, running seminars at your children's schools and sixth forms, and also privately working with families through our one-to-one study skill coaching programs for students, where we would pair a student and a coach and work one-on-one and build them a tailored program. If you are interested in our one-to-one coaching, I'll talk a little bit more at the end about sort of what it involves in the process, and how you can get in touch, and we can talk more about that. So currently we work with over 3,000 schools across 15 different countries and over 1 million students and thousands of families as well across the globe. So that is Elevate in a nutshell. That's what we do. Let's move on to talking about the sort of main content for this evening's webinar, which is memory and memorization. So I wanted to introduce you to a student. We find it really useful. We do this in quite a few webinars of sort of talking about a specific student that we've worked with, to sort of introduce you to some of the sticky areas around memory and how we can help. So this is the profile of a student we worked with called Sarah. We worked with her in our one-to-one coaching. And her program was really specifically focused on helping with memory. So just to give you a little bit of context, when I first met Sarah and was doing her diagnostic session, the diagnostic session is sort of the session to understand her study skills. What I could instantly see is that Sarah had so much potential. She was clearly a really hardworking, diligent student. Motivation wasn't an issue, which was great, but there was a real lack of congruence between the amount of work and time that she was putting in and the results that she achieved. When I spoke to her mum, to Sarah's mum, actually she said that her motivation had always been quite high, but she was starting to see it wane, starting to see her getting a little bit more demotivated because she just wasn't seeing the tangible results of the effort and the hard work that she was putting in. Sarah's mum was saying, it's so strange because, the feedback from school is that Sarah's working really, really well in class and her homework's coming back and it's always great. But for some reason, when we get into that test environment, it's just not reflecting the work that she's putting in. So what we were finding is that really there were some fundamental issues around the way that Sarah approached memory. I want to add a little caveat here, just to make it really, really clear that you can't actually change somebody's memory. We're not going to be talking about that. However, what you can do is improve a person's processes of memory. So we're really clear, and we put sort of a great importance on that when we're talking to students as well, that we're not saying, we don't use binaries around good or bad. Instead, we're not talking about a memory being weak or strong. We're talking about the processes of memory maybe being a bit underdeveloped, and that's where we can help. So, little caveat there. So, with Sarah specifically, we found that there were 3 major problems with her memorization processes. So, we found that she got very easily distracted and she lacked focus. When I sat down with her, and I'm sure many of you guys have found this with your own children, when Sarah was sitting down to do, say, 60 minutes of work at her desk, it wasn't necessarily 60 minutes of work. There were quite a lot of distractions in her environment, and actually it probably meant that of that 60 minutes, maybe about 35 minutes were concerted sort of high quality work. The rest of the time was a little bit sort of in the distraction zone. So although she was putting in these hours sitting at the desk, actually because of the lack of focus, she wasn't putting in as much time as she felt. A significant amount of time was being wasted. Second thing for Sarah was difficulty memorizing concepts. So for Sarah, it was particularly when it came to sort of sciences, that was her real sticky area for memory. And if your child is sort of maybe year 9 and above, I'm sure you can absolutely relate to this. Sciences are heavy on the content, and also technical vocabulary, words that we're not necessarily, using in our everyday lexicon, can be really, really hard. And the final thing for Sarah was forgetting key information during exams. That was probably the biggest sort of demoralizing impact for Sarah, because actually in the exam or the test itself, with that stress and anxiety that's natural in that environment, she'd have those sort of tip of the tongue, mind blank moments where she'd forget the things that she knew, information that she'd been over. It wasn't through lack of trying, but she was just having those mind blanks due to the environment. I'm sure so many of you have had this with your own children, or maybe had it even yourself when you were doing exams, where you go, oh, it's so annoying. I just couldn't remember the answer, even though I know it and I've revised it. It's really, really frustrating. And this happened to Sarah in a few of her mocks. And she would get into the exam, freeze, and understandably get really upset. And this was, of course, like the big thing for Sarah's mum and her family, was that we really wanted to reduce that overwhelm, reduce that stress, get her through the exam and get her the grades that she deserved. So there are sort of 3 key issues that you can see here that we identified with Sarah. What I'd love to know is actually if you feel that any of these apply to your child. So if you could use the chat box now and just put in 1, 2, 3. You absolutely don't have to choose just one if you feel all 3 of them relate to your child. So just put in a 1, a 2, or a 3. So 1 for easily distracted, 2 for difficulty memorizing concepts, and 3 for getting the information in the exam room. That would just be a really, really useful litmus test for Jess and I, and Elevate in general. So we've looked at the problems. Let's actually look at the sort of framework for how we can course correct, how we can aid and strengthen those processes of memory. So what are we going to look at? We're going to look at 3 different processes: attention, storage, and recall. So attention, when it actually comes to memorizing information, the neuroscience and the psychology suggests that first and foremost, we need to be paying active attention. And if we're not paying active attention to the information we want to memorize, it just won't lock in. Big issue here tends to be that students don't actually take much care and attention over this stage, and actually about 60 to 70% is sort of spent on the work in front of them, and 30 to 40% is spent, as we were saying before, on distractions, not quite funneling into the work that they have to do. So the question, of course, becomes, well, how can we improve that percentage? How can we get them closer to 100%? And this is the particular area that we worked on with Sarah, showing her ways to make her environment when she was studying more conducive to study. and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. The second process is storage. So once we're paying that active attention, then we need to be able to actually effectively store that information. So storage is really dependent on the techniques, the strategies and the tactics that we use to memorize information. We can read it, we can write it, we can use it, and we can also look at some more advanced techniques in those areas, because often what we find is that students get quite stuck in the zone of rereading, rewriting their notes and just sort of repetition, rote learning, whereas actually that is very inefficient. It can work, but it's going to take a really, really, really long time. And sometimes students spend so long in that notes section of revision that maybe they're not getting on to higher leverage tasks, like maybe doing a practice question or maybe doing a quiz if they're a younger student, or doing a question from the back of their textbook. That's actually practicing application, which we really, really need. So we want to free up some of that time from sort of rewriting and repetition with our notes and look at some higher leverage, more dynamic techniques for memory. We'll talk about that later too. And then finally, the final process we're going to look at is recall. So unfortunately, I always say this to students, it's annoying, but someone at some point is going to ask, do you know that? They are going to ask you to prove your knowledge and demonstrate that you can recall it. So it could be in a few different ways, but of course the most common that we're thinking of is probably the exam or a test. So on the day, in the room, we're going to need to be able to recall that information. If we can't, it's going to be sticky. Also, we need to be able to apply it to the situation. So what we did here with Sarah is look at sort of removing those mind blanks, looking at giving her a really clear process in the exam room, and then also to strengthen her recall, practicing it as well. So ultimately then, really by our work in sort of all three of these areas, this in turn for Sarah showed a real uptick in her marks in her next exam across all of her subjects, which was fantastic. We were so happy about that. And she actually improved her grades by an average of 23% across the board, which is fantastic. It's not the be all and end all grades. That's not really, what we say at Elevate, but it is about a student getting their potential. And for Sarah, it felt like memory was holding her back from her potential. So we were really glad that it boosted there. And this sort of shows that this framework really is just about improving the individual stages, and the outcome will take care of itself. Really similar idea to sort of compound interest. Small actions done across time lead to big outcomes and big changes. So today I'm going to take this framework that we've got here of these three different processes and show you how you can help your children make improvements in each area. So we'll go through attention and then storage and then recall. But before that, we are going to do a little bit of a quiz. Do not worry, this is not a quiz about your knowledge, it's about your children, so there's no right and wrong answer. What I'm going to do a little bit differently this time is, rather than doing a couple of questions in a row, I'm just going to ask one question to lead into each section. So it's just going to be one question now, and then we'll have a few more later on. So if you could pop your answers in the chat box, we would love to see them. So first question is, what distracts your child the most? I'm so intrigued by this. So what would you say distracts your child the most? A, their phone. B, social media in general. C, video games. D, Netflix / I would say YouTube or other streaming services. Or E, music. What would you say distracts your child the most? So if you could pick A, B, C, D, or E, or if you feel like there's a really important other specific distraction for your child, pop that in the chat box as well. And I'm going to take this moment to have a little sip of tea. Lovely. Great, I can see lots flooding in. Thank you, guys. So, yeah. This usually is the case. We're getting so many A's. Phone, that is the most common answer that we find when we speak to students directly as well. When we ask them this question, they say phone tends to be the tricky one. So what's really good about this is, once we can identify these main distractions, then we can actually make them the focus. We can say, okay, let's zone in on that. So why is that important, that zoning in? Comes back to this quote that we have here. So this is Pareto's principle from Vilfredo Pareto that you can see at the bottom there. So his quote is, 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. So this might be something that you guys have heard before. If you've attended another webinar, you might have heard us talk about it, but it's really relevant here. So what we're saying here relating to attention is we really want to say that 20% of the distractions, the things that are distracting, are usually responsible for 80% of the distracting. So a small amount of distractions, they are culpable for the majority of the distracting. So the question becomes for you guys, what are the main distractions that your child has? How can we then remove them? Because the main thing for us is going to be about increasing your child's attention in this stage, and then we're going to move on to sort of memory techniques in a moment. As we said before, if we're increasing your child's attention by 5%, 10%, a small gain at the beginning, but a massive gain when you actually accumulate that time across a week, a month, even a year. So we're going to adopt Pareto's principle here. We're going to look at the two main distractions that students experience, that we hear from them themselves, and how we can deal with them. So, number one, multitasking is a myth. Sometimes people get a little bit annoyed when I talk about this, but yeah, that is the truth. Multitasking is a myth, even if we think we're quite good at it, which I'll put my hand up to. So this ability to successfully multitask, like I said, it's a little bit of a fallacy, but it's still one of the main issues that students have with their attention. So many students, and I would say adults as well, like to think, oh, I can juggle 3 or 4 things at the same time. I can absolutely be, doing that homework while I'm maybe, online shopping and maybe also listening to a podcast. We love to think that we can. Actually, what we're tending to do is just toggling our attention. So briefly, I'd like to do a quick activity. I'll remind you guys, you are not visible. You're in the comfort of your own home. It's only me that is visible, so don't worry about embarrassing yourself with this little exercise. This is something that I always do with students in my seminars. So what I want us to do is the idea of holding up 2 fingers like this. So 2 fingers to the tip. We want to circle 1 forward, like that, and 1 backwards, okay? 1 forwards and 1 backwards, nice and easy. However, what we're going to do now is we're going to multitask. So we're going to try and do it at the same time. So one's going forward while the other's going backwards. So 3, 2, 1. This is the moment where I'd absolutely love to see you all, because I'm sure facial expressions are hilarious. So, how was it? I was just about able to do it, but I would say I've practiced quite a few times. So for you guys, probably what happened is you started off being like, I can do this. And then suddenly both the fingers started going in the same direction and they were just working in sync. What is the point of this activity? The point is that it's very, very difficult to focus on 2 things at the same time. And this is my physical analogy that I use with students to make that sort of penny drop moment. So in reality, what are we talking about in sort of real life situations? Generally, when we get to a moment like this, where we're thinking, very hard to focus on these 2 things, we normally fall into 2 boats. So we've got people in one boat, people in the other. First boat, they tend to say, I can't do this. I'm overwhelmed. I'm just going to put those tasks to the side. What we call that is cognitive overload. So the cognitive load is the amount of information the information that the brain is receiving. So in this case, if we've got cognitive overload, we've got too much information to process, too high. So it leads us to that path of least resistance, which we've talked about a few times. Path of least resistance in this case is to shut the laptop, shut the book, shut the task, and do nothing. Or alternatively, if you're in boat number 2, you might just be doing what we said before and going, I am multitasking, but actually you're just both going forwards or both going backwards. And in real life, that would be, you think that you're doing the tasks equally successfully, but actually you're not. So what I'm trying to say is multitasking is very difficult. It's not that we can't do it, it's not impossible. Some of you would have been able to. I'm just about when I practice it, but it's actually, what we're doing is toggling between 2 tasks. We're not doing them simultaneously. A really useful analogy that I use to sort of explain this to students is a bridge. So if you imagine you're in a car, you're on one side of the bridge. To get across that bridge, we have to pay a toll. It's a toll bridge. So every time you cross the bridge, to get from side to side, you have to pay a toll. So that's what it's like with your brain when we're trying to multitask. Every time we're switching or toggling between these tasks, we're paying a toll. And the toll that we pay is our attention, our ability to get into deep focus. So if we are flipping between 2 tasks, multitasking, it looks possible, but actually we're paying a huge toll each time we flip between them, and that toll is our attention. And as our attention depletes, it's more difficult to concentrate. So we can't study for as long, and we're not giving our full attention to either task. So how do we remove multitasking from the occasion? What can you guys practically do as parents and carers and families to help your children? Well, the first thing we want to do, sounds simple, is make sure that we're only ever doing one task at a time. So to do one task at a time, we want that to be represented physically. So for your child, it might be if they're studying online on their computer, it's that they only have that tab, that one tab open that they need, or that piece of software or program. They have everything else shut down, and they make a really conscious effort to do that at the start of their study period. Or it could be if they're working at their desk, they don't have their other textbooks or, work booklets, exercise booklets, revision guides around them. Physically on the desk, we only have that one thing. That's going to limit our ability to multitask because it's not easy to grab something else. We've got to go and get it from somewhere else. So a clean, clear desk and clean, clear computer. Limiting tabs, yeah, as I said here, that is a really simple but such a sort of high yield tip that we say to students, is that actually it can make us feel quite productive. If we've got loads and loads of tabs up, we're thinking, yeah, I'm going to do that later, amazing. We don't want them all open, they are distracting. The way to sort of counteract that could be having a bookmark bar or having different folders for different tabs that we have to come back to, but at the time when we're working, just one tab that we need. So what we're really doing here is just increasing that probability that we won't be distracted. They are really simple tips, but I promise you, if your child could just give 30 seconds at the beginning of their study to make sure that they've got clean, clear desk, focusing on one task at a time or limiting tabs, it will absolutely aid their attention. So, second one, this is a little bit more controversial. This is about music and study. So the question that I always got asked the most, whatever my seminar was about, whether it was about motivation and mindset, whether it was about well-being, whether it was about revision, I'd always be asked about music. Students would say, Molly, can I listen to music while I'm studying? Can I do that? And I would always say, generally, the answer is no, but I'm going to give you a little bit more info and unpack that. So let's get into the research. What are we talking about when we're talking about music? So one positive thing, start with the positive, with students who listen to music while they study, is that they might have a little added boost of motivation. It might actually help them get started with a task that they don't want to do. They're associating something that they don't really like doing, potentially, which is maybe studying this certain subject or task, with something that they do like doing, which is hopefully listening to music of their choice. However, when we actually start doing the work, the music is not helpful. So for motivation, I say to students, how about when you're setting up your desk, you're clearing your space, you're getting into that headspace, maybe you've got 5 or 10 minutes of listening to music, but then when we start the work, we've got to turn it off. Why? So what does the research actually say? So what the research says, this is widely known, not just our research, is that listening to music can improve performance in manual tasks. So could be sport, could be training at the gym, could be cleaning, could be washing up. All of those things, music can definitely increase our performance and productivity. However, unfortunately, this is not the same with study. Second thing to little note is that blue bullet point here. This is just that some of you might remember this. There used to be a sort of a thing called the Mozart effect, which was if a young child or even infant, or sometimes even a baby in the womb, it was thought if they're listening to classical music, then actually it will make them more intelligent later in their life. It was disproved, unfortunately, but it was a real sort of boom of a theory in the early 2000s. So yeah, just chucking that in, extra tip, unfortunately, it's not true. Thirdly, what are we actually going to look at? Music generally decreases performance in academic tasks. That's the information that we really need to zone in on. So it's decreasing our performance. It's not making it impossible, but again, we're looking for those small gains of win. So if something is going to make performance harder, make us more inefficient, we don't want to be doing it. And an extra sort of thing to note here is that music decreases performance, particularly with memorization. So memory is like a high intensity workout for your brain. It's very different to other types of study. So particularly for memorizing, we need to eliminate music and audio stimulants. So the way that you can frame this to your child without getting too sciencey like I just did is to say, imagine if you were listening to a song. Okay, if you're listening to a song while you're doing your maths homework, unconsciously, you're going to be spending 50% of your time trying to memorize the lyrics of that song, unconsciously. And then the other 50% is going to be trying to memorize the information we've got in front of us, the maths equation. So actually, if you imagine for every 60 minutes you're sitting at your desk, you're only getting half of the information memorized. You're only really working for 30 minutes. So you've got 30 minutes of wasted time there. Is that a good payoff for just listening to music? I would say every student I've ever met says no. They said they'd rather sit there for 30 minutes, get the same amount of work done, and then go off and listen to their music or watch Netflix or whatever it is they want to do. And the reason for this, if you are interested in the science, is that our brains have something called a phonological loop. So that's part of our working memory that deals with audiological information. So if that part of our brain is being occupied by listening to music, then it's harder for our memory to store other information at the same time. Like I said, not impossible, but so much harder. The other thing to say as well, and particularly when it comes to revision and exams, is in an exam situation, is your child going to be able to listen to their music? No. The answer absolutely in the UK is no. We do not have music when we're in the exam. So actually, if we get quite sort of codependent with our music and we think, this is the thing that, helps me study, this is the thing that means I can concentrate, if we tell ourselves, I work better with music, actually then we come to an exam situation that becomes really stressful because we've removed that sort of safety blanket and suddenly we're in silence and we're thinking, this isn't how I work best, I really don't like this. So unfortunately, if we're going to have silence in the exam room, we want to practice that situational learning and we want to make sure that we're testing the way that we work, our memory, practice papers, without the music because we won't have it later. And why that could be bad is not only will we feel a little bit, stressed that we don't have the music when we're there, it will also lead to those mind blank moments if we've, entered an environment that we're not prepared for. So that's the science, that's the reasoning behind it. And if you want to sort of give them an example, you can use that example of sort of listening to music, toggling 50% of your attention to remembering the lyrics. So what then becomes the compromise? We don't want to be horrible. We're not trying to rip it away. What we would say is the compromise to start off is listening to music without lyrics. So lyrics are the real tricky point here. So could you listen to, potentially, could your child listen to classical music if they're into that? Could they listen to their favourite songs but instrumental versions? Could they listen to chill out music? There are so many on YouTube and Spotify for free and many that you can download as well that are sort of study playlists that are specifically to aid study and do not have lyrics. That would be a great place to start. However, the ideal would be moving towards complete silence and working in a quiet space where we can focus. We absolutely love and we champion working with friends and working in study groups, but for memory, that's a high intensity workout for our brain. So that wants to be a solo task in a quiet space, ideally with no music at all. Before I move on, because I'm aware I spent quite a lot of time here, but I think it's really important to get the environment right. The other thing that I would mention in terms of sort of memory and attention is sleep. We're talking about sleep a little bit more in our well-being and managing stress webinar that we'll do later in the year, but sleep and memory are so intrinsically linked. So one of the most simple but important things your child could do to aid their memory is getting close to 8 hours in that revision period when maybe they're focusing on memory, and also building a sleep routine that stays the same Monday to Friday. We'll touch a little bit more on that, like I said, in other webinars, but yeah, sleep and memory, very, very strongly linked. So if we can get the sleep good, the memory will follow. Great, let's move on to our next section. So we've got another question. So if you could pop your answers in the chat box. And the question is, how does your child memorize information currently? What are they doing at the moment? Are they A, mainly reading their notes? Maybe that's class notes, maybe that's textbook, maybe that's notes from the teacher, like summary notes. B, are they mainly writing out their notes, rewriting from their exercise book or from textbooks? C, are they mainly quizzing themselves? Could be with you, maybe asking, getting you to quiz them, could be online, could be Seneca, things like that. D, are they using mainly mind maps or visual aids, pictures or mind maps in some form? Or E, are they doing something else? So how does your child mainly memorize information? Again, just going to have a little bit of tea while the answers are flooding in. Wonderful, thank you guys. So, lots coming through, but yes, it seems like generally the trend I'm hearing from Jess is A and B. So mainly we're hearing reading their notes and writing out their notes, with a couple of others absolutely scattered in there. And that really, really aligns with, excuse me, that really aligns with what we hear from students themselves as well, and from teachers, is that mainly students are rewriting and rereading their notes, which we call rote learning. As I said, not bad, but is really inefficient, especially as we get up to GCSEs, when we've got, many subjects to juggle at the same time. To rote learn for all of those exams would be tricky. So let's make their life easier and also a bit more fun. It's a bit boring, isn't it, rewriting and rereading? So let's look at some more dynamic and slightly more fun techniques. So up here, just wanted to show you a little bit of data. This is from one of the schools that we surveyed, to the response of asking students how they normally memorised. And we chose it because it's really representative of the majority of the schools that we survey. So as you can see here, that we've got a total of 82.6% of students are memorising their information through reading their notes and over and over again, or writing them out. Again, as I said, rote learning. So this might be a problem for your child, and if it is, we want to show you what you can do differently. As I said, we really want to move away from that, and we want to use effective techniques that we call higher order memory techniques and semantic learning techniques. So if you wanted to jot those phrases down, if you wanted to have a Google, so higher order memory techniques and semantic learning techniques. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of the techniques now, the sort of basis of them, but if you do want to know more about them, the title of each one will be up, so you can absolutely jot that down and have a Google after the webinar. So first technique that I want to introduce you to is the Feynman technique. So this is the concept that we don't truly understand information unless we can explain it to somebody else who knows nothing about that topic, and we've got to break it down very clearly. The way I like to phrase it to students is, you've got to be able to explain it to an alien, to someone who has no idea what you're talking about, and if you can make them understand, that shows that you know it. So for students, a really good way to check that understanding, and also helps them memorize as well, is to practice explaining that information to someone else. So we call that teach to learn. So how can we go about practically sort of implementing this technique with your child? So step one is to get some notes. We need notes in some form. So we are going to be discussing notes a little bit more in other webinars, but the main hot tips that we talk about with notes are the 4 C's. So that is create your own, put the information in your notes in your own words, create your own, condense, make sure that they're short and sharp and concise. Use colour codes to help you remember, so use codes for different types of information, and use a Cornell structure. So I don't have time to go through the Cornell right now, but if you wanted to jot it down again and have a Google, it's a great way of students making really, really clear notes, revision quality notes first time round. So that's Cornell. So once we've got some form of notes, then we've got to explain the concept to someone. So this is where you guys could come in as parents and carers and families. You could get your child to explain their notes to you. Lots of parents say, actually, when they do this with their child, it's really useful because they've forgotten a lot of this information, and they're like, oh yeah, I did know about that at one point, but I've definitely forgotten what meiosis and mitosis is. So yeah, it can absolutely upskill you as well. However, if you're thinking, Molly, that wouldn't work for me, we're not going to be able to, me and my child, study together, you could potentially get them to do with a sibling or with a friend. If they've got a study group, a couple of friends that are really good study buddies, that would be a really good thing to do. Also, it sounds a bit weird, but even if the person isn't a person, that's okay. So even you could be describing to a pet or even a cuddly toy. It doesn't necessarily have to have someone who's going to bounce back for you. It's just the process of verbally explaining. However, it's more fun to do it to a real person. Then, step number 3 is get asked questions. This is where the pets and the cuddly toys wouldn't be able to come in. This is what we want. We want some element of testing. So if you're doing it with your children, could you quiz them from their notes? Could you, maybe form a couple of shorter questions, medium questions, longer questions for them? Then, I'll pop back to step number 3. If that's hard for you and you're thinking, I wouldn't know how to do that, you could potentially ask them questions from maybe the back of their textbook or their revision guide that's relating to the topic, if you didn't feel like you could formulate them yourself. And then step 4 is to grade themselves. So it says yourself, but that's for the student, to grade themselves using a traffic light system. So this works as follows. Anything in their notes that they are able to explain coherently and thoroughly, put a green mark next to that. Anything that they feel like they explained it quite well, but maybe they didn't get all of the details, put an orange mark next to that. And anything they fully didn't remember or they didn't understand when you were quizzing them, put a red mark next to that. And then when they go back to review their notes, because we don't want to just do this once, we want to do it a couple of times and check back in, then what it becomes is a really, really clear focus to move red to orange and orange to green. You would have heard me probably talk about this traffic light process a few times before in different areas, but it is super, super, super useful and really simple. All it needs is 3 highlighters. That's all we need. Then we want to repeat the process. So checking in with our notes is not something to do once, but it's a great thing to schedule maybe once a month or, once a term, or for maybe A-level students who've got a few less subjects, once a week. That would be really, really useful. So if there can be a sort of process to it and a schedule, that's fantastic. The next technique that I want to introduce you to is a little bit different. So it's a semantic learning technique, which is a really great way to mix up learning styles for your child. As I said, rote learning, rereading, rewriting, it's pretty boring. So we want to keep memory fun and engaging, and also that's actually really useful for hacking our memory as well. So semantic learning, if you're wondering, it's simply connecting what we don't know with something that we do know. So creating a link between something that we don't know, something we do know, linking them together. And one of the really amazing properties of our brains is that we're incredibly good at creating connections. We create connections and elicit meanings between things that don't even have meaning sometimes. So what we want to do, as I said before, hacking our memory, is this is a quality that we want to use to our advantage. We want to use semantic learning to create and cement these connections, and that's going to help memory. So let's dive in. So the name of this technique is just here, is substitute word method. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about it or see people on YouTube using it for different content, please do note that down and have a Google later. So it's particularly good, this technique, for learning foreign languages, which is one of the biggest challenges, I would say, that we have from students, and absolutely for me as well. I did German and I found it very tricky. But yeah, substitute word is super useful for languages. It's also really useful for any technical vocab, so any sort of language or phrase or term that is not in sort of everyday usage, so scientific vocabulary, complex vocabulary in any subject, but particularly for foreign languages. So that's what we're going to look at today. I'm going to apologise in advance to any Spanish speakers on the call. I will do my best with my pronunciation, but I do apologise if it's not fantastic. So we have 2 words here. We have arroz and pluma. So I'm going to say them again. Arroz and pluma. So arroz means rice and pluma means pen. Okay, fantastic. Some basic vocab. So what we need to do in this technique is, the clue is in the name. We need to replace the term with a similar sounding word. So we're substituting the word that we need to know. That's the term. So in this case, our terms are our Spanish words. So arroz, with a th at the end, and pluma, they are our Spanish words, so we need to replace with a similar sounding English noun. Now, noun is really key here because we don't want it to be some complicated word that's a theory, because it needs to be really easy to visualize and potentially to draw. So we want to go for a simple noun. So what are we going to choose? I'm going to choose, for arroz, I'm going to choose arrows. That's a simple noun that I can easily visualize, and it's really, really closely sounds like arrows. I'm going to remember that link, okay? So that's my substitute word, arrows. For pluma, I might use puma, like a puma on a puma shoes, or I might use plum, perhaps. I think I'd probably go for puma myself. That's the other thing to note here. There isn't a right answer. Your child doesn't have to do my example. They would do the word that instantly comes to them. We always say use your gut here, because your gut is probably right. So use the word that sounds like the term that for you is the sort of instant thing that pops into your head. So then we move on to step number 3, which is creating a story to link the terms. Now, this can be in a few different ways. It doesn't always have to be a story. It could be an image, or it could be a visualization. Those are the sort of 3 stages. So story is probably our most basic, image is our next stage up, and then visualization is when we're super, super pros. Obviously, as we are on a webinar, I'm going to do a story, because drawing something right now would be quite tricky. So let me give you my story, which is to help me remember that arroz means rice. Okay. Arrows and rice. I've got to link, remember, these 2 words, arrows and rice, in my story. And with a story, we always have to remember 4 key things. So our 4 keys of memory are making it about me. It's got to have me in it, otherwise I'm not going to care. It's got to be fun and weird, so I remember it. It's got to be active, something's got to happen in it. And it's got to be sensory. I've got to be engaging those senses. So the way I describe it to students is our stories want to almost be like mini action films. They can't just be, I walked down the street and then I saw an arrow. Is that interesting? No. Is it fun and weird? No. So think about it like a little mini movie. So this is my story for you. So I am going to my favourite Chinese restaurant in Brighton called China Garden. It's fantastic if any of you are in Brighton. And I'm sitting down with my family, and I ordered some egg fried rice. And the door to the restaurant opens from the kitchen, and the waiter comes through holding this little bowl of steaming egg fried rice. I can smell it. I can almost taste it. Places it down in front of me. I pick up my chopsticks. I go to grab that first grain of rice, and just as I'm lifting that grain of rice to my mouth, the door opens and a guy comes in and says, "Everybody get down on the floor. I'm robbing this joint." And I'm like, whoa, robbing this joint? No one says that. Who's this guy? And then suddenly, before I even think about it, I pick up my bowl of egg fried rice. I throw it across the room. And suddenly, in slow motion, every single grain of rice, as it falls out of the bowl, it flies through the air and turns into an arrow, like a bow and arrow. And the guy is pinned up against the wall, sort of Western style, by all of these arrows all around him. And everybody in the restaurant stands up and applauds me and says, "Molly, you've saved the day. You get free egg fried rice for the rest of your life." That's the end of my story. As you can tell, I quite like telling stories, so your child's don't have to be that over the top. But yeah, that is my story. So what we do now is we can work both ways. So if we're thinking, okay, my Spanish word is arroz, what's my sounds like word? Arrows. Okay, what's my story about arrows? Oh yeah, the arrows, the rice turns into the arrows. Great, that's my link. Arroz means rice. But also, it works the other way. We can say, okay, well, I know that rice, I've got to find the Spanish word for rice. What's my story that had rice in it? Oh, yeah, Chinese restaurant, rice. Rice turning into the arrows. Arrows is my sounds like word. Arroz. There we go. So when I verbalize that, that might sound quite complex. But actually, what happens is when we use this technique regularly, that becomes second nature. We don't have to sit there and verbalize the way that we're tracing back the words. That link becomes inextricable. And as I said before, story is the sort of starting point. Then, an image. So for me, my little thing is I draw a little bowl of steaming rice and I have a bow and arrow pointing out of it. That's my sort of memory image. And then when you're even more advanced, that just becomes a visualization. You can skip those steps. But yeah, start with a story. And remembering that we want to have those 4 keys. So it's got to be fun and weird. It's got to be about you. Your child's got to put themselves in it. It's got to be visual and sensory, and it's got to be active. Something's got to happen. So think about it like a mini film. So if we were going to do pluma, again, I would do my sounds like word. So puma, I would probably have maybe something to do with a puma jumping towards me, and maybe I stab him in the eye with a pen. That's what I would think of. Again, go for action, go for drama. And there's my little puma there. So, and there's my little image. So that is what we want to do with substitute word method. We're taking vocab, foreign vocab, or we're taking complex terminology, and we're replacing it, we're subbing it out for a word that is a simple noun that we can visualize, and then we're creating that story or that image. There are two other methods that we talk about in our sort of memory sessions we do at school and our coaching. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all of the techniques tonight, but I wanted to give you the names of them so that you can potentially Google them or have a research yourself. So the other techniques we use are method of loci, that's LOCI, also known as the mental journey. So method of loci, that's really useful for remembering information in a list, so terms in a list, and it's all to do with creating like a journey in a familiar location and having objects representing the terms or the words that we need to know. So method of loci, and peg words, peg like a clothes peg. That's really good for when you need to remember a couple of key concepts, so quite good for humanities in that way. Also really useful for dates as well, and that's to do with having numbers and having a rhyme for each number, and they become your pegs that you peg information on the washing line. So method of loci and peg words. So as you can see, I really, really like these. They really, really work. We get such great feedback from students in school and in our coaching. And the reason I would say is because firstly, it works and we can demonstrate that quite clearly, and secondly, it's fun. We really want to make memory and make studying fun and effective, and that's what these techniques do. So let's move on from attention and storage and to our final process, which is recall. So as we sort of said at the beginning, unfortunately, students are going to be tested on this information at some point, whether it's in the exam room, whether it's in a different capacity. I'm sure we've all had to deal with sort of the emotions that can come when we've maybe ourselves come back from an exam, or potentially your children have, and they've said, I completely blanked. I just got in the exam room and I completely blanked. It's such a frustrating situation to be in. And something that we work on with students in our coaching programs is strategies to make sure that students are never caught in that situation where they feel like the answer is on the tip of their tongue. They feel that it's just out of their reach, and they're stressed, they're running out of time, and they can't remember. We really, really want to help students with that. Firstly, because of course for that exam it's really important, but also it's a knock to their confidence, and that can have a knock-on effect with future exams as well. It's frustrating, but it is avoidable. So let me explain how we do that. So in coaching, we try and use relevant examples, as you will have seen me previously. So hopefully most people know who these people are. We've got Bart and Lisa Simpson. So for this example, let's say that they both had an exam last year. Let's also say, for argument's sake, that they are in the same academic year, okay? So same year, same exam. So looking back 6 weeks before the exam, they're both preparing. Pretty good, but they're doing it in different ways. So Lisa is going to spend 2 hours studying for the exam, but she's not going to do it all at once. She's going to do 30-minute chunks across a few weeks. She's going to split her work up into chunks. However, Bart is also going to do 2 hours of studying in total, but he's going to do it all before the exam. So we've both got 2 hours. However, we've got Lisa is going to do it in these chunks here, and Bart's going to do it all in one go. So 2 things to note. They're going to do the same amount of work. They're even using the same techniques, let's say, to make it a fair experiment. But one of them is doing it over the course of a few weeks. One of them is doing it in one sitting. So now we get to the animation moment. There we go. Look at that. So smooth. We're at the exam day. Who would you say is going to remember more in the exam? Do you think it's A, Bart, who's done all of his revision in one 2-hour chunk, or B, Lisa, who's spaced it out? What do you reckon? Please use the chat box if you wish. Some answers flooding in. Let's go for this. So Bart cramming, Lisa spaced. Or C, neither. Who reminds you of your child? I can see lots and lots of A's flooding in. So, apologies, I asked you 2 questions there, really. So firstly is, what do you think is better? And then secondly is, what sort of method reminds you of your child? A's are flooding in for sure. So, who is actually going to remember more? Ladies and gentlemen, I can reveal it's actually Lisa. So spaced learning is much, much better than a crammed approach. So I think the A's were probably you guys saying, that's my child, rather than thinking that Bart has got the better method. So what's Bart trying there? That's something called massed learning, or more commonly known as cramming. I'm sure many of you have done a last minute cram at some point for an exam. That's when we do a lot of something in a short period of time. It's usually very close to when we're going to have to recall the information, because we think if I can get it all in there, I can retain it for a short amount of time, it's going to be more readily available. Actually, what often happens for people who cram, it might be more readily available, but we don't have time to thoroughly understand the information, associate it, create those links that we were talking about before, and apply it. Often, if we're cramming the information, we're not going to be able to have that step of application and applying the knowledge. Whereas Lisa's almost always choosing the correct method, isn't she? What we've got here is we've got spaced learning, so little and often. We've got her breaking her 2 hours into 30-minute chunks and doing it across a few weeks. So what's really, really important is I want to show you that actually most students think that Bart is the way to work. Most students say that cramming information and doing it quite close to the exam, working on their memory just before the exam, is the most effective, but it's not. Actually, we want to go for spaced. And why? Well, this is the reason. So the reason is this curve that we have here called the forgetting curve. For those of you who might want to know a bit more about this or do a bit more research, this forgetting curve was created, and the theory behind it, by a person called Hermann Ebbinghaus. And essentially, he's the sort of godfather around research about memory, recall, and recognition. So he found through this experimentation that he did that there is something called the forgetting curve. And how he did this is he actually got people to try and remember or memorize sort of nonsense words, so gibberish, words that weren't in any language a real word. So he went about it in two ways. He had two groups. He had one group using the mass method, so trying to cram in a lot of information in a short time, and one group was doing the space method. And what his research showed was that the spaced method led to far, far better recall results. Really, we're talking about huge percentages here, 30 to 40% greater retention of this information that he gave them. And the reason that it was sort of gibberish or nonsense was that they couldn't have any unfair advantage. They didn't know these words beforehand. So what we then found, what Ebbinghaus found, is this forgetting curve, which you can see here. So basically what this is showing is the most important part of memory. This is going to sound counterintuitive, but the most important part of memory is actually forgetting. So as humans, we're pretty good learners, we're okay, but we're phenomenal at relearning. So hopefully, might even be with this webinar today, we're doing it together. We're talking about these different techniques. Maybe you're going to start at 100% if you're paying attention. I'd love it if you are, but it's absolutely your prerogative. So say you're starting at 100%. Obviously, that's going to decay over time. You know, when we finish in a few minutes, you'll close the computer or the laptop and you're not going to remember absolutely everything. However, if you're working with spaced method, you're going to forget it less quickly. That's the key thing. We are going to forget. That's impossible to eliminate, but we're going to forget less quickly. So that's this whole notion of spaced learning, which really means that if your child is doing little and often across time, they're more likely to remember the information. They're not having to do more work, the hours are the same, but spacing it out will be more effective. So this is really, really important research, but practically, what should your child do? Probably for you guys, showing them this forgetting curve isn't really going to be a penny drop moment. So let me show you a few ways that you can sort of implement this. So we know about little and often, but how can we sort of do that? So what your child should be doing, ideally, what the sort of gold standard is thinking about reviewing their homework, or not just their homework actually, but their content immediately. So what we want to be doing is, if we are in class, we want to review immediately. So that means at the end of the lesson, having a quick glance over, a little bit of a refresh of that day's lesson. Or if it's independent study, having a read over the notes that they've been making. Then we want to review that information a day later. So tomorrow, again, we glance over it. Then 1 week later, we want to have another little read of it. And then finally, 1 month later, we want to give a little bit more time and review it a little bit more thoroughly. Now, I know you might be sitting here thinking, Molly, that sounds like a lot of work. You're just asking them to work 1 day later, 1 week and 1 month. However, what I would say firstly is review does not mean sit there and study for ages. We're talking about a skim read, a scan read of the information, just to keep checking in with it. And the other thing that I would say to maybe rebuttal against that, against a potential criticism, is that if a student's in their final years, so maybe if they're in year 11 or if they're in year 12 or year 13, they're going to be a lot more amenable to this, because what we're actually showing them is they're not going to have to spend as much time in their final revision chunk later in the year. That's going to become easier and faster if they can build in this system of review. So yes, for maybe younger years, year 7, year 8, year 9, if we could maybe just go for this review immediately and review 1 week later, that would be fantastic. However, for older students, we want to do all 4 of these stages if we can. And as I said, the gold sort of shiny thing to circle for everyone is reviewing immediately. That's really, really important. So if a student can find just 30 seconds to a minute at the end of their lesson before they close their book to reread what they've written, that is so useful and will absolutely aid their memory. The other things to look at, if possible, is the reviewing 1 day later and 1 week later. One quite easy thing with the reviewing 1 day later that we say to students is, do they have some sort of commute to school? Do they get the bus, or do they get the train, or are they driven in? If so, could they utilise that time to look back at yesterday's work? Then it becomes really easy to review 1 day later, because all we're doing is on a Tuesday we're looking at Monday, on a Wednesday we're looking at Tuesday, and then yes, we have to carve out a little bit of time on Saturday to look at Fridays, but we're not talking about a lot of time here. We're talking about maybe for if they have 5 or 6 lessons in a day, maybe we're talking about 10 to 15 minutes of review. So a couple of different ways to do it. We could just use this system of review like this, which is sort of glancing and checking back in with information, or we could use a few different ways. So this logo here represents a piece of software and an app called Anki, which is fantastic. That's ANKI. It's really, really great for memory. And a little disclaimer, we're not affiliated with it, so Elevate aren't involved in it in any way. It's just something that we really know to be very, very useful. So how it works is it's effectively a digital flashcard app, and it really works well for spaced learning, because what happens is that it actually makes sure that the flashcards that you haven't checked in with recently go to the top of your pile. So you can't get into that sort of subject bias where maybe you're just flicking through those couple of flashcards that you know and neglecting the ones that you don't know. With Anki, you actually can't do that. It makes sure that you check in, and also you can set spaced learning reminders. So you can say, I want to check in with this, every other day, or I want to check in with this once a week. So it's a really, really great way for students to keep on top of this spaced learning. So that app is called Anki, ANKI. So, final takeaways. We'll move through these 3 takeaways. I'll tell you a little bit about coaching, and then we'll have our Q&A. So, number 1 is we want a narrow focus on one thing. We want to limit distractions around us and avoid multitasking and avoid music. Definitely the lyrics. Music without lyrics can be all right. Then we want to move on to rote learning is inefficient. We want to move away from rewriting and rereading, and we want to move to more advanced techniques and dynamic techniques. So Feynman technique, teach to learn, speaking our notes aloud. We could also have audio flashcards. We could use Anki, the app. We could use semantic networking techniques like substitute word, method of loci, making those memory stories. We want to have a couple of different routes back to the information. So this is the information in the middle. We want to have a couple of different pathways back, because if then one pathway gets blocked, it's okay. We've got another one. And then finally, we want to be focusing on spaced learning rather than massed learning. So little and often, spacing it throughout the year, doing a system of review, using flashcards, but actually using them. So not just making them and then never looking at them again, checking back in with them, setting reminders as well. So that is memory. Thank you so much, guys, for attending this webinar. I really hope you found it useful. Our next webinar, we're actually doing a double this month, is going to be on Tuesday the 28th of November, and it's going to be on resilience. Really, really useful topic, I'd say, especially for students who've got exams this year, this academic year. And then the final thing to talk about is coaching. So I know I've mentioned it a few times. So we offer one-to-one study skill coaching. It's private in the sense that it's arranged directly with families. It's one-to-one, so we would pair a student with one of our Elevate coaches, and it's a bespoke program. So we'd actually build and design a program for the individual student. So if your child maybe struggles with memory, or if they struggle with revision or time management or motivation or well-being around workload, or sort of the day-to-day skills of focus and attention and how to make notes, we coach from year 7 right up to year 13. So if you'd like to book a phone call with us to discuss coaching, you can do that by just scrolling down on the page you are now and selecting a time. It will be a 15-minute call with either myself or Jess, and we'll give you a call and just speak over the phone. And then if you are interested, then we would book in your child a diagnostic session. That diagnostic session would be over Zoom. It would be an hour and a half, and it's a free, no commitment session as well. And that's where we would sort of build a program recommendation for them. So yeah, if you are interested, please do book a call with us. The final thing to say is if you've got any feedback on the webinar, we love to hear it. There's a feedback form again on the page you're viewing the webinar now, if you just scroll down. And let's move into the Q&A. So I'll take a couple of questions and then we'll wrap up probably about 5 past. So, question number 1. Sometimes my daughter has exams with a week's notice. How could she make sure that she's prepared for these? Really good question. Something that actually came up in our exam webinar that we did before. If your daughter doesn't get that much notice about a test or an exam, what we always say is notes can be made throughout the term. We can always be working on notes, because as soon as we've had a lesson, we can, if it's Cornell notes, we can do our little summary, or we can highlight it, or we can make our flashcards. So keeping on top of notes throughout the term means that when we come to revision, that bit's going to be saved. The other thing to say is that notes is sort of memory are part of a 3-stage revision process. So we've got notes, then memory, and then testing ourselves. So we want to keep in that order, but if your daughter could make sure that the notes are just always up to date, all she's going to have to focus on is memory and testing herself, which should be okay within the time frame. So I hope that's helped. Number 2 is my child's mock exam results came back and they're really down and they're not sure what to do from here or what to focus on. Firstly, I'm so sorry. That's such a tricky one when your mocks just don't go how you wanted. What we would always say is mocks are an ability to learn about ourselves. They're an ability, they are excuse me, can't get my words out. They are an opportunity, is what I'm trying to say, an opportunity to illuminate our mistakes. So how we talk about doing this with students is we talk about making a bulletproof booklet. So what that really means is it's logging all of our mistakes that we make in practice papers or mocks, and then making like a revision guide from our mistakes. So it becomes really useful because it becomes a targeted revision guide for ourselves. So how your child could do that is if they went through their mock and they highlight every question that they didn't get full marks on, and then they want to create like a table or a template or a spreadsheet, however they want to do it, and they want to write down what was the question that they got wrong, exactly how was it phrased, why did they get it wrong? Did they misunderstand it? Did they misread it? Was it not complete? Was it lack of understanding the content? And then what's the correct answer? And then also the topic. So we want to label the topic, and that's really useful because it could be that potentially it's one topic that keeps coming up and up again in maths or biology or whatever it is, and then we can sort of track that. That's what we want to do. We want to say, what's the question? Write that down. Why did we get the question wrong? And what's the correct answer? And then once we have that all in one table or one document, we can then print that out later, and that becomes a revision guide. When we don't quite hit what we want one is just an opportunity to illuminate our mistakes and learn from them. Second thing would be to maybe go to their teacher, especially if there are a few subjects that were really drastically lower than they were expecting. Say, you know, could I have a 5-minute or 10-minute meeting with you where we go through the paper one-on-one, or I ask you specific questions. In most schools, in my experience, after mocks, teachers will be doing that. There will be a process of going through the questions and talking about it, but it absolutely doesn't hurt for your child to ask for a bit more time. And then once they understand where they've gone wrong, a really great thing would be to fix that mistake by potentially redoing those questions from the mocks. So if they're short questions, they could redo the whole thing. If they're longer questions, like 20 or 25 or 30 markers, maybe don't redo the whole question because that would take a while, but redo the sections, the paragraphs or the points that were wrong. And then what actually happens is we can get out of that sort of negative spiral of thinking, oh, I'm not good at this, because we can show ourselves, once I've course corrected and I've redone that question, I got it right. So that's great. Next time round, I'm going to be good. Then another question that we have here is, my child rushes through exams. How can he work out how long to spend on each question? Such a good question. Yeah, that's something that we'll actually look at in our exam room skills webinar. So what you can do is you can do total marks divided by total time. So if your child is in GCSEs or A-levels, they will be able to find out how many marks their paper is and what the time is for that. So how long will they be allowed to spend on it? So they can actually do that calculation way, way ahead. I'd say that's a really good, useful thing to do, you know, as your very first revision task. It doesn't have to be in the exam. And then you can know your ratio. So you can say, great, I know for history, I've got about 1.5 minutes per mark. Or I know in maths, I've got 1 minute per mark. That's a really useful thing to do. So find out your ratios per subject and then, you know, sort of apply that when you're in the room. Another little tip would be to look through all of the paper at the beginning, have a little glance over everything, check the back just in case, and then get a sense of how long the exam's going to be. And final question, my child can end up hyper-focused on his phone and ends up just scrolling for hours, even if he wants to do the work that he just can't stop on the phone. Anything I can do here? Yes, absolutely. We definitely give some tips for this. So we talk about putting anti-procrastination apps on a phone. Ideally, in an ideal world, we'd have the phone completely out of the room, but it might be for your child, if potentially they need to use their phone, we want to put anti-procrastination apps on there. A couple of ones that we recommend: Forest, really, really great. Hold, Self-Control, Focus Me. So I'll say them again. So Forest, Hold, Focus Me, Self-Control, and Study Bunny is another one I'd recommend. So they all work in slightly different ways, but the general principle is that they're limiting apps, social media, things that you don't want to go on, but they are allowing you to still have the functionality of the phone. So if your child needed to get onto, you know, apps for school, they could, but they wouldn't be on the apps that distract them. Right, that is where I'm going to wrap up, guys. I'm sorry I've gone slightly over today. Memory is just a bumper topic. I really hope you found it useful. And as I said, our next webinar is going to be on the 28th of November on resilience. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your evening. Bye.